All right, welcome in everyone to another deep dive with us. This time, we're going back in time a little bit, back to 1984.
Oh, wow. 1984. Okay.
Yeah, July 4th, 1984 to be exact.
Yeah.
We're headed to Beverly, Massachusetts.
Sounds intriguing. What are we diving into?
Well, we're going to be looking at a tragic fire that happened at the Elliott Chambers Rooming House. And we've got some excerpts from a Wikipedia article, with all those details you love, pulled from newspapers and investigations from back in the day.
Ah, primary sources. Always a good starting point.
Absolutely. And we're not just going to focus on the fire itself. We're going to see how this event kind of rippled outward, impacting legal cases and even fire safety regulations for the whole state.
Now, that's what I call a deep dive.
Yeah.
A single event can be such a turning point.
Yeah.
It's like it really shows how sometimes, unfortunately, it takes a tragedy to expose these systemic issues, the things that might have been overlooked. And then it forces everyone to reevaluate, like, how we do things, how we can prevent it from happening again.
Exactly. And that's what makes the story so compelling. So picture this. It's early morning, July 4th, a holiday, right?
Right.
And the Elliott Chambers, this 80-year-old, three-story wooden building right in downtown Beverly. We're not talking fancy condos here. This was a rooming house, 34 rooms.
Oh, wow. 34 rooms in one building.
Yeah, and it housed mostly low-income folks. A lot of them were actually placed there by social service agencies.
That adds another layer to it.
Yeah.
You've got a vulnerable population living in a structure that, well, maybe met the minimum safety requirements back then,
Maybe.
but probably lacked those crucial fire safety features we kind of take for granted today, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a head-scratcher when you read about it. The article mentions they did have smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, and a fire escape, so, that's something.
Yeah, those are definitely the basics. But like you said, it's 1984.
You're right, no firewalls.
Yeah.
And no sprinkler system. How was that even allowed?
Well, like everything else, safety standards evolve over time. Think about it, like seatbelts in cars. It took years for those to become mandatory everywhere.
That's true.
And similarly, in 1984, the understanding of fire science and prevention just wasn't as advanced. The Elliott Chambers fire, sadly, it became a tragic catalyst for change, a very hard lesson.
Yeah. And from what I read, the fire itself, it spread through the building incredibly fast. The article really highlights how the stairway, which was unenclosed, acted like a chimney, pulling those flames upward. And of course, all that wooden paneling throughout the building, it just added fuel to the fire, literally.
Oh yeah, I bet. Sadly, that's a recurring theme in a lot of these historical fires. You see similar issues, like in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. That was in New York back in 1911.
Oh, right. I remember learning about that one.
It's a horrific story. But again, that open staircase, flammable materials all contributed to the rapid spread of the flames and the high death toll. It's a stark reminder that building design can be a matter of life or death in these situations.
Absolutely. And in this case, it's just heartbreaking to think about the victims. 15 people lost their lives, 11 more injured. Can you imagine? Some were found near locked fire escape
Oh
door.
my gosh.
The panic. Others were still in their beds, overcome by smoke. They even had trouble identifying some of the bodies because the burns were so severe. The human cost, it's just unimaginable.
Absolutely. And it's here where the story takes, well, maybe a more complex turn. The investigation immediately suspected arson, intentionally set, and they focus on a man named James Carver. His ex-girlfriend was dating someone living at the Elliott Chambers.
Okay, so we've got a love triangle, we've got a fire, and we've got potential arson. This is already getting intense.
It is, and there's more. The article mentions that Carver had a history of mental health struggles. He even attempted suicide after the fire.
Wow, that definitely complicates things. Makes you think about his state of mind, leading up to the fire.
Right. And it's where the ethical considerations of our legal system really come into play. How much weight do you give to someone's mental state during an investigation? Was this individual truly capable of intentionally starting a fire that would claim so many lives?
Tough question.
These are the questions that would basically haunt the legal proceedings for years to come.
So they arrest Carver. And get this, he goes to trial. Not once, but twice.
Twice. Wow, what happened?
The first one, it ends in a mistrial. Seems like some kind of legal technicality. A discovery violation, they called it.
Ah, yeah, those can be tricky. But the second trial, he's convicted of both murder and arson.
Yep, convicted. And the article, it points to eyewitness testimony as a key element in that conviction. There were several people saying they saw Carver near the Elliott Chambers around the time the fire started.
That's interesting. It really shows you how our legal system back then grappled with this whole concept of reliable evidence.
It's crazy, right? Because even today, like eyewitness testimony, it's not exactly the gold standard, is it?
Not really, no. Our memories can be pretty unreliable,
Hmm.
especially in those, high-stress situations, like a fire.
Exactly. Plus, you've got to factor in potential bias. I mean, people can just make mistakes.
For sure. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Fast forward a few years, and those advances in fire science, they start to cast doubt on the original investigation. Experts began to question if the fire was even intentionally set in the first place.
You mean like maybe it wasn't arson after all?
Right. They started looking at, like, the electrical wiring in the building, whether a discarded cigarette could have started it, or maybe even faulty appliances.
So they basically re-examined the whole scene with a more modern scientific perspective.
Exactly. It's amazing to think how many other cases might have been decided differently with today's technology and understanding, right?
It's pretty mind-blowing. So where does the Innocence Program fit into all of this? I know they were involved in Carver's case.
Yeah, so they took on his case back in 2022. They argued that the evidence used to convict him, well, it just wouldn't hold up in court today.
That's a game changer. Imagine after spending decades in prison for a crime you might not have committed, and then new evidence comes to light.
It's like something you'd see in a movie. But this is real life.
So what happened? Did they overturn his conviction?
Well, not quite. But in 2024, he was granted a retrial, and he was actually released on personal recognizance while the Essex County District Attorney's Office appeals that decision.
So the legal battle's still going on, but at least he's not in prison anymore, at least for now.
Right, waiting for a chance to maybe clear his name.
It makes you think about the burden of proof and how incredibly hard it must be to prove your innocence, especially after so many years.
It's a tough road. But this fire, it also had a huge impact beyond Carver's case, didn't it? It led to those big changes in fire safety regulations in Massachusetts.
It did. Immediately after the fire, Beverly's mayor, John Monahan, he was pushing for stricter fire codes, especially for rooming houses.
Yeah, he argued that these types of buildings, like the Elliott Chambers, they needed to be held to a higher standard. It was all about protecting those residents who were most at risk.
Makes sense. But I bet there was some pushback, right? I mean, new regulations often mean spending more money.
Oh, definitely. Governor Dukakis, for example, he initially wasn't too keen on mandatory sprinkler systems. He cited the cost, saying it would burden property owners, particularly those providing low-income housing.
Yeah, it's always a balancing act, isn't it? Safety versus affordability.
It is.
But in this case, it just seems like being extra cautious would have saved lives. So what happened? Did they pass any new laws?
Yes, they did, eventually. But it took time. It wasn't until 1986 that they passed a law requiring sprinklers in certain types of multifamily dwellings, like rooming houses. The Beverly fire, it was definitely a driving force behind that legislation. It showed lawmakers just how deadly these fires could be.
So even though it's tragic that it took such a horrible event to make things happen, at least some good came out of it.
I think so. The Elliott Chambers fire, it was like a wake-up call. It forced people to really look at those fire codes and to demand better protection for everyone, especially those living in older buildings.
Speaking of the building, is it still standing?
Nope. They actually rebuilt it as an office building at first, but then eventually they tore it down in 2009. A CVS pharmacy stands on the site now.
That's kind of like, I don't know, it's weird, right? Replacing a place of so much tragedy with something so, well, ordinary.
I know. It's like life just goes on, even in those places where something terrible happened. But they did put up a plaque, commemorating those 15 lives that were lost.
A small reminder, at least. Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with a fire, then we went through a murder trial, and now we're talking about sprinkler systems.
It's all connected. And that's what I think makes these stories so interesting. One event can have so many repercussions.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I've got to ask, what's the biggest takeaway for you? What really stuck with you about this whole story?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's a reminder that justice, well, it's not always a straight line. The James Carver case, it really highlights how our legal system can be flawed, and how new information can completely change things.
Yeah, it shows you can't just assume that because there was a verdict, it was the right one.
Exactly. We have to keep questioning, keep looking for the truth. And even beyond that, I think the Elliott Chambers fire, it's a stark reminder that these safety regulations, they're constantly evolving for a reason.
What might have been acceptable back then, well, it's just not good enough today. And listening to all of this, it really makes you wonder. And listening to all of this, it really makes you wonder, could something like this still happen today? I mean, sure, we've got better fire codes now, but there's still a lot of older buildings out there. And let's be honest, not every landlord is rushing to, like, install the latest safety features.
That's a really good point. Even with stricter regulations on the books, enforcement is key. And then there's the whole affordability issue. Cities are trying to provide more affordable housing, right? But sometimes maybe safety measures get overlooked or compromised to keep the costs down.
It's like that old saying, good, fast, cheap, pick two. But when it comes to people's lives, it seems like safety should always be the top priority.
Ideally, yes. But unfortunately, the reality is a lot more complicated. We need to find ways to incentivize building owners to really prioritize those safety upgrades, even in those older buildings that maybe aren't as profitable. And as a society, we have to be willing to invest in affordable housing that doesn't cut corners when it comes to safety.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's like we started with a fire in a single rooming house, and then it exposed these flaws in building codes, raised questions about the criminal justice system, and even sparked a movement for safer housing. It makes you realize that history isn't just some boring stuff in a textbook. It's connected to the challenges we're facing today.
Absolutely. And it shows why it's so important to stay informed, question what we think we know, and keep pushing for progress. We can't afford to become complacent, right? We need to learn from the past and use that knowledge to make things better for everyone.
Well said. So, to our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. Take a look around your own community. Are there buildings that seem like they could be fire hazards? Are there people living in conditions that might not be safe? Maybe it's time to ask some questions, speak up, and be an advocate for change. Sometimes it's those small actions, those voices that speak up, that lead to the biggest changes.
And remember, every time you see a sprinkler head or a fire escape, there's a story behind it. It might be a story of tragedy, but hopefully it's also a story of progress and, people working to make the world a safer place.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe, everyone.